Okay, so welcome everybody to this webinar on an introduction to CLIL for secondary teachers. We're here in France, and this webinar is obviously aimed at our French audience, but we do have people joining us from across Europe. So we're very pleased to welcome you all. I'm George Wilson, and I'm Head of English and School Education at the British Council in France. And I'll tell you a bit more about our work in a moment. But I'm thrilled to be here today with Hélène Delpont, who is an English inspector from the Academy of Créteil. So Hélène, importantly, participates in the jury for the secondary DNL certification or CLIL certification each year, and she's passionate about project-based learning. She'll be talking us through that certification and talking to us a bit more generally about why it's a good idea to do it. Jason is also with us, Dr. Jason Skeet. He's an expert in CLIL, an expert teacher trainer, and he's worked internationally for the last 15 years training teachers around the world. He's also worked extensively in bilingual schools in the Netherlands, and he's also the author of our recent report on the landscape of CLIL in France today. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. And let's get started. Before we begin, we have today the Q&A function, question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. Please use that to ask us questions all the way through, and at the end, we'll set aside some time to answer them. You will get a certificate for attending this webinar, and we'll be sharing the link to download that at the end. And of course, please talk to us in the chat all the way through, answering the questions, sharing your reflections as we go along. Today, we'll be working on an introduction to the British Council. We'll be looking at why you might teach your subject through English and how to obtain a certification in DNL. And then we'll move on to some top tips from Jason for teaching subjects through English or indeed through other languages as well. And at the end, as I said, we'll have time for questions. Okay, so first of all, do tell me in the chat, but I hope you've all heard of the British Council. The British Council is the UK's international organisation for cultural relations and creating educational opportunities. Part of our work in France is supporting English teaching and learning, but also supporting the teaching of subjects through English. We do that in a range of different ways, notably through our research that helps people think deeply about education systems and about language learning. We create events that enable people to exchange best practice and exchange ideas about the different fields of language learning, teaching, and assessment. We go into academy and we offer advice on projects, on steering committees, and so on, drawing on our range of experts from around the world. We have a whole range of resources, which I'll mention in a moment, and we do some training just like today. You can stay in touch with us and follow all our news through our newsletter, which is available on this link. It's a teacher development newsletter that you want to sign up for. Okay. As I mentioned, we have a whole range of different resources and training options for teachers around France and for teacher educators, the people who train teachers. And all of that can be found on our Teaching English website, teachingenglish.org.uk. Now that link will take you to an Aladdin's cave of webinars, online courses, resources, research, and other things to support you in your development. It's worth saying that it's completely free. And when you do a webinar like today, or take part in a course, you get a certificate that can help you within your professional development. We also have a teacher development framework that helps you take ownership of your development by placing yourself on different scales for different competencies around language teaching. We also, and a useful resource if you're launching a CLIL project in your school, we have a partnership finder developed by the French Ministry of Education and the British Council, which enables you to define what you're looking for, whether that be physical exchange with the UK, virtual exchange, pen pals, or anything else. Just enroll on the platform with your school and define your project. And there are thousands of schools in the UK waiting to connect with you. So that's an overview of the British Council. But let's move on now to Hélène, who's going to take it away with how to obtain a certification in DNL.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's working. Okay, thank you. Right. So when we talk about their certification, there are two steps really to get the certification in English or any other language. So I'm going to take you through those two steps. Step number one, you need to submit a paper, and depending on your academy, it has to be sent either to the DEC or to the SIEC in Île-de-France, where I work. You need to send it to the SIEC. And if you're not sure, contact your inspectors because they will know for sure where to send your paper. Now, the time is just about now, so you need to really get in touch and understand all the administrative process. In Île-de-France, for example, you have until October the 27th to enroll, and then you will need to upload your submission paper before November the 17th. And this, you have to do that on CLIL. You're all familiar with CLIL, I guess, with the baccalaureate. Now, your paper should include a brief resume focusing on your experience, whether you have studied abroad or whether you have experienced teaching or co-teaching in a foreign language. You should also present significant elements explaining your choice to teach your subject through a foreign language. And what I could help you with is probably advise you not to hesitate to include elements showing both your implication and your motivation. For example, if you have already taught a lesson in English, or if you have tried it with your students, then feel free to include it as an example. Or if you've participated in a project with your colleagues, describe it briefly and explain, for example, how it has enriched your teaching. Now we'll move to step two, which is the oral exam. Now, this exam is the real exam. It will consist in a 10-minute presentation, strictly in English or in any other language, if you've chosen to present the DNL in another language. And then it will be followed by a 10-minute interview in both English and French. Now, your presentation must be different from your paper because we, the jury, read your paper beforehand. So what you can do is briefly remind the jury of the reasons why you want to get the certification, but then you need to quickly move to more interesting things, such as the presentation of the work you do, or of an e-tweening project, for example, you have worked on, or a project involving co-teaching in your school, and so forth and so on. So here are a few tips maybe. Try to concentrate on being very concrete and try to make it clear for the jury why teaching in a foreign language can be a game changer both for you and your students. So we can focus, for example, on the competences developed by the students, on the importance of multiculturalism, on how you would include new teaching skills to your day-to-day practice, and maybe also how you imagine getting involved in an international project in your own school, because this is really something that we value. Finally, just a quick reminder that to get the certification, you need a B2 level in English. and a minimum grade of 10. So basically, it means that to be B2, you need to understand the essential content of a rather complex text, but obviously this aspect won't be tested during the exam since it's an oral exam. But most importantly for you, it means that you can communicate spontaneously and easily with a native speaker, and that you can express a clear opinion on a variety of topics. So my point is that you are not expected to be completely bilingual. You need to be able to speak English quite fluently, but if you make some mistakes, it's no big deal. So you should go for it. Now, why would you want to teach your subject through a foreign language? And we'll move to my next slide. So I guess we can answer this question from a double perspective. Teaching English in a foreign, in a foreign language, so in English, can be a source of motivation for teachers, but it can also be a great source of motivation for our students. Now, for teachers first, getting the certification means that your personal skills are going to be valued. And so as a consequence, you will be able to access what we call the poste spécifique, in schools offering European sections, for example, or international sections, or the BFE. But even if you don't access those positions right away, you can always rely on this certification to promote CLIL pedagogy in your school and maybe initiate a project that could lead to the opening of a new European section. Indeed, if you introduce DNL teaching in your school, then you will be part of a larger project, most probably leading to a high level of collaboration with language teachers, if there are several in your school, with foreign assistants, with e-trainings, with Erasmus Plus, with the British Council and other international partners, which in itself is really thrilling and ambitious for all the teachers. So from a personal and professional point of view, getting this certification is very stimulating and very interesting. Now, for the students, it will also constitute an opportunity to broaden their minds and to develop incredible skills. CLIL or DNL teaching relies on project-based learning, which implies an interdisciplinary approach. And I'll just give you one example as a teaser. In the Académie de Créteil, we developed a project called Eco Clubs. Now, the aim of this project is to teach sciences in English. And so to do so, we ask science and language teachers to work hand in hand to help students choose an issue related to climate change and to think of how to approach the problem and to try to come up with scientific solutions. Now, at the end of each year, we organize a huge conference of all the eco clubs, and the 400 students participating in the eco clubs must prepare a 10-minute presentation in English explaining their work. Now, doing so, they develop oral skills. They develop their abilities to listen to each other, their abilities to work in groups, to collaborate, to speak in public, to develop critical thinking. They experience ambition, and all of this while learning sciences and English. And what I really find impressive is their implication and motivation. So if it wasn't clear enough, I can only encourage you to experience teaching your subject through a foreign language. And once you do that, just go the extra mile and try to get the certification, because I'm convinced that you'll find it very enriching. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hélène. Just before we move on, we've got a couple of questions for you. Does the
Yep.
submission paper have to be written in English?
It can be bilingual, it can be written in French, it can be written in English. It's your choice. Now, what strictly needs to be in English is the oral presentation, really. But
And
the
that's true.
submission paper, yeah, can be bilingual. And sometimes we get, French papers, and it doesn't really matter.
And presumably, if you want to use Spanish, you can write in Spanish and so on.
And of course, I'm saying English because
Of course.
obviously the
Yeah.
British Council. It's all about English. But of course, if you choose like Spanish or Italian, and yeah, maybe one important thing I didn't mention earlier, if you speak several languages, you can also present the GNL in all the language that you speak, basically. So you can present the GNL in Spanish, for example, and in English the same year at the same time. The exams occur at the exact same time, so you will be coming only once. So yeah, this is good to know as well, because every year we welcome professors that present both GNL. So, and I find it very ambitious.
Brilliant. And just a couple more questions before we move on. Is the
Yeah.
certification open only to teachers who are certified teachers? So presumably working within the Education Nationale with the CAPES?
That's a good question. So it would be, for example, for
I imagine it must be a contractuel, but feel free to tell us in the
yeah.
chat.
Well, I see no reasons why you would not be allowed to present the certification, but maybe I'll ask the questions and just make sure that I'm giving the right answer, because I don't want to.
Okay,
Yeah, I'll ask my colleagues and try to get back to you before the end of this webinar.
brilliant. And if not, then there is an email address at the end, so the person can ask us the question and we'll reply. Just a few more questions, Jason, and then we'll hand over to you. Does the Eco Club initiative exist in other academies?
Unfortunately not, but I would love to develop it in other academies. So if you're interested, please contact me and contact your inspectors and tell them to talk to me.
I knew you'd say that.
It's a really great project.
It is.
And
Very.
what I didn't say is that we work with higher schools of education. So we work with Centrale Supélec and Ponts et Chaussées, and they're mentors for our students. So they co-teach with the teachers, which is also a very interesting experience.
Brilliant. Two more questions and then we'll leave you. Can the resume be in English and the rest of the paper in French?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And if we present the certification in two languages, do we have to write two papers and do two oral exams?
Yeah, you need to take two oral exams because you need to be speaking both languages so it can
Yeah.
be validated. And I guess you can use the same paper roughly, but you will have to make it clear why you choose this specific language.
Okay.
In other words,
And
I wouldn't say I was brought up in Great Britain to present the Spanish DNL. You would have to explain why you speak Spanish and why you feel that you want to teach in Spanish as well.
okay. And I have obtained a DNL certification, but I've changed institutions. Is my certification still valid?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't think there is any amount of time or minimum amount of time. So yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't be valid.
Okay, great.
Once you get it for life. It's a life.
And last question for now, and we'll take more at the end. Can you just
Yeah.
repeat where they can register to the certification?
Well, in Créteil for sure. Well, Île-de-France, Paris, Créteil, and Versailles. It's the siècle. It's not through it's not going through us. But I guess in other academies they don't have siècle. Usually they have decks. So I would suppose that it's with the deck. But again, I advise you to get in touch with your inspector because for sure they will have the answer and they will give you the right information. And you need to do it now because I know that the dates are like now. I mean, in Ile-de-France, it's before October the 17th. So you really need to contact your inspectors right away.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ellen. And we'll move on. We'll come back for more questions at the end. But for now, let's hand over to you, Jason, and your top tips.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So, as George mentioned earlier, I'm a teacher trainer, and one of the areas that I focus on is CLIL, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning. I believe that's been translated into French as Emile. I'm not going to try and give the full translation. But what I want to suggest is that the relationship here between CLIL and DNL, that CLIL can be thought of as an approach to the way you plan and teach your DNL lessons. So the tips I'm going to talk about are about putting CLIL into practice. And you can see the 5 tips on the screen there. Tip 1 is plan sequences of learning using the 3 dimensions of CLIL. I'll need to explain in a moment what I mean by the 3 dimensions of CLIL. Tip 2 is base the teaching and learning on tasks. I'm going to have to define what I mean by a task in CLIL. Tip 3 is guiding learners' understanding of lesson input. Input means, you know, this might be you talking, giving a verbal explanation. It might be text that learners read. It might be a video that they need to watch. This is all the input in a lesson. Tip 4 is supporting learners to produce output. That's their own speaking and writing. And then the final tip is identifying the language of your subject. And when we get to that, you'll see that I want to suggest that that language is more than just the vocabulary that's specific to your subject. Now, I'm going to be talking for about 30 minutes, and I have said to George to please interrupt me if questions come up, and it's worth answering those questions at that moment, okay? So I don't mind being interrupted, George. Let's start then with tip 1, which is plan sequences of learning using the 3 dimensions of CLIL. So what are these 3 dimensions? Well, you can see them on the screen there. There is, first of all, a conceptual dimension. So this is focusing on what learners are learning about the subject. So it's the subject knowledge, it's the subject understanding, attitudes and skills. But by calling this the conceptual dimension, what we're also emphasizing here is that this learning on this dimension is related to the thinking that goes with your subject. To put that another way, learners are learning to think in particular ways, arguably to look at the world in a particular way in terms of your subject. They're learning to think like historians or like geographers or like scientists or like mathematicians and so on. At the same time, they are also using language to learn and indeed learning to use language. So that's the linguistic dimension here. And that involves using everyday language. It involves using language, academic language that goes across subjects. It involves the language of your subject. It also involves learning language skills. And then there's a third dimension, which is the procedural dimension, because what we're asking learners to do is to do things with the concepts and with the language in terms of completing activities and completing tasks. So there's this procedural dimension as well. Arguably, all of that, all those 3 dimensions form the content of a lesson. You can see as well that I've got a picture of a mixing desk there on the screen, because the other aspect to this idea of 3 dimensions is to think about each of these dimensions as being like a separate volume control to the lesson, okay? Each dimension has its own volume control, and at particular moments in a lesson and a sequence of learning, you're going to, as the teacher, put more or less emphasis on one of these dimensions in relation to the other dimensions. Right, that sounds quite abstract. So let me try and show you what I mean in practice. So here on the screen, I've got a very simple sequence of learning involving just 3 activities. So this might be maybe a third or perhaps half of a lesson. I'm also not making it subject specific, because I know amongst you, you're all teaching different subjects. So I didn't want to focus on a particular subject, but also I want to focus on the underlying principles that are being used here in terms of adjusting the volume controls. So we start in this sequence of learning with a starter activity, right? And the purpose of a starter activity is to get learners warmed up. It's to frame the learning so that the lesson is put in relationship with other lessons. Also to activate prior knowledge. That's really important because learning is a process of building new knowledge on top of existing knowledge. So in this example, we've got a very simple starter activity involving the teacher either reading or maybe showing on an interactive whiteboard statements about the topic that the lesson's about. And the statements are either true or false. Now, all the learners need to do is put up a card to show whether they think a statement is true or false. Green for true, red for false. So procedurally, that's not asking learners to do much. So the procedural volume control is low. Likewise, the language is also low because the learners don't need to produce any language. And the language that the statements are written in or being read out in is also going to be familiar to them. The concept volume control is a little bit higher than the other two because it's possible that there may be some new facts or new knowledge for some or maybe all of the learners as, you know, among these statements. But the principle here is at the start of the lesson, the volume controls are relatively low. Then we go into the next stage of the sequence. And here we are seeing the language volume control go up. Because what the teacher wants to do here is prepare the learners for the third stage, prepare the learners with language that they're going to then encounter in a text that they're going to read. They're going to put the volume control up so that the learners do some work on some language that they're going to need to know and understand for the third stage of the lesson. The language volume control is therefore higher than the other two. In this case, the learners are going to be discussing in groups the meanings of some words that they're then going to encounter in the next activity. They could be doing other things as well in this stage. They might be, for example, doing some matching words to definitions. You might give them dictionaries and to find out the meanings of words. There's lots of options here. But the principle is that you're making the key language salient, highlighting it, making it relevant and useful so that they can use and understand that language in the next stage of the lesson. There's also another principle here, which I call the pinball machine principle, which is to think of a lesson like a pinball machine, and that the learning involves, for learning to happen, it has to involve lots of hits, right? Multiple hits. For that to happen, learners need to encounter new words and indeed new concepts in multiple ways and across the different stages of a lesson. So in this case, they are encountering new words at the pre-reading activity stage and then also in the reading task, so that third stage. In this case, my example is that the learner is going to do some reading and the reading task involves identifying causes. So this is something to do with the topic for the lesson. And then as a group, ranking those causes in terms of their order of importance. And there may not be right or wrong answers to that. Maybe the teacher is interested in the thinking that is going on. But at this stage, in this third stage, the volume controls, all three are going up because procedurally it's getting more complex. There's more language demand on the learners because they're going to have to talk with each other, and they're going more deeply into the topic. So the conceptual volume control is going up as well. Let me now show you how to think about this idea of adjusting these volume controls and sequencing the learning over an entire lesson using what I'm calling a 3-course meal lesson plan. And you can see that this lesson plan involves 3 main stages: a starter stage. So this is where we're going to be focusing on activating prior knowledge or indeed experience of the language or the subject content. You've got options here in terms of what you're activating. Also, the purpose is to orientate the learners, to stimulate them in terms of their curiosity, to frame the learning so learners understand how the lesson fits with previous lessons. And very important as well, to share the learning objectives for the lesson so they know where they're going in their learning. The main course is then where you're going to be achieving those learning objectives. I'll come back to the options about sequencing in that main course in a moment. There is a third main phase to this lesson, which is the dessert, right? This is the moment, maybe the last 5 or so minutes in the lesson, where you get the whole class together and you check that learning has really been achieved and the learning objectives have been reached. By the way, just as an example, it's one of my favorite reflection tasks, is just to ask learners at the end of the lesson, what have you learned? But also, how have you learned? And that how is important there, because it helps learners to start to think about the process of learning and to learn about learning, if you like. But let's go into the main course, because it's there where you're really going to have to think about the sequencing of the learning. And there's different options, and you might not be doing all of this that you can see in the on the screen there. But for example, you might plan and sequence the learning so that you're moving from general ideas gradually into more specific concepts. At the same time, or alternatively, you might think about the learning as progressing from, an initial encounter with new language and concepts into tasks that help to consolidate the learning, into tasks that involve some kind of transfer where concepts or skills from previous stages in the lesson or previous lessons even are transferred into new contexts and new kinds of tasks. Or alternatively, the learning might be planned, particularly in terms of the conceptual and the procedural dimension. It might move from lower order thinking into more challenging higher order thinking. Or at the same time, or alternatively, on the linguistic dimension, you might be planning the sequencing so you move from a word level, learners working with vocabulary, then to sentence level, so they're working at a sentence level, and then encountering texts. Lots of ways of thinking then about how learning is sequenced. The point as well, though, is that tasks build on each other, like the example that I just showed you with a pre-reading task, then moving into a reading task. And the tasks themselves, and we'll look at this, I'll talk about this again in a moment with tip 2, the tasks are broken down into steps. And if necessary, learners are provided with language support. So we'll look at that again with tips 3 and 4. Right, so I've already talked or given you a lot of information just for tip 1, which was plan sequences of learning using the 3 dimensions of CLIL. Let's move to tip 2, which is to base the teaching and learning on tasks. When I am saying base the teaching and learning on tasks, I don't mean that every single second of a lesson, learners are engaged in this notion of a task that you see on the screen. Although there's no reason why you couldn't design a lesson like that. But it's also likely that there's going to be moments in a lesson when learners have to, for example, listen to you as the teacher. But what you're doing by basing the learning and the teaching on tasks is that you're using tasks as the key ways in which the learning objectives are going to be achieved. But also you're using tasks, and by learners doing tasks, learners are providing you with evidence of their learning. So using this task-based approach is also a way to then be able to see the progress that learners are making. But when we're using this task-based approach in CLIL, there's a very particular definition of a task that I've got there on the screen. So first of all, a task is goal-oriented. In other words, it's linked to achieving a particular learning objective. And it helps, of course, for learners to know what that goal or objective is. That helps them to know where they're going in their learning. The second aspect of this definition, and this is the crucial bit, is that in CLIL, a task requires interaction among students. They will be working, when they're doing a task, with a partner or in groups of 3 or 4. So it involves interaction. Now that interaction and the procedure will need to be sequenced. So there will be clearly identifiable stages, and some tasks are likely to be more complex than others. For example, a jigsaw reading task, for example, where you have a text and it's cut up into sections, and you first of all set up the learners into groups, so particular groups that are studying a particular section of the text, becoming an expert on that section of the text, and then you rearrange the group so that each group contains experts, then teaching back to each other what they've learnt by reading their section of the text, so that in the end, everybody has an understanding of the whole text. Now that's quite a complex procedure in comparison with, say, for example, a think, pair, share task, where you give learners a question or a problem, they think on their own, they then partner up, share their ideas, ready to share with the whole of the class as a final sort of stage to the task. So that's a more simple task. And of course, a task requires a set of clear instructions. So these are the instructions that you're going to give to the class. It helps to have, as well as verbal instructions, the instructions perhaps written on the whiteboard, for example. And also, in a CLIL lesson, it's important to check that learners have understood instructions. So you might use a technique like asking learners to repeat the instructions back to you. But what's really crucial here, I want to emphasize it again, is this notion of interaction. And let's look then at types of task in CLIL. Now, this is not by any means all the different possible types of tasks. It's just one way of looking at the task types. There are many other ways, but it's a useful way of looking at different types of tasks. So we have, for example, tasks that involve listing. For example, learners in groups doing some brainstorming about a topic. We have ordering and sorting tasks. These might be tasks that involve putting something into a sequence, or ranking, or putting things into categories, classifying things. We have matching tasks. We have tasks that involve comparing. We have problem-solving tasks. Arguably, subjects like science and maths are particularly well suited to a problem-based approach in lessons and problem-based tasks. We have creative tasks involving learners actually creating something, like, for example, I'm sure you as teachers will come up with lots of ideas for creative tasks, but maybe they create, for example, a board game in history about a particular topic, or maybe a three-dimensional model showing a scientific process. And the final task type that I've got there on the screen is the notion of projects, which Helene mentioned earlier. So this can also be considered a task type. Projects, now those will probably extend over more than one lesson. And as Helene also mentioned, They can involve other subjects, so they can be cross-curricular. Okay, so that's tip 2. Tip 3 and indeed tip 4 are related because this is another perspective on the lesson. I talked about the 3 dimensions of CLIL. Now another perspective on the lesson, indeed your D&L lessons, is this notion of input and output. Guiding learners' understanding of the lesson input, whether that's you providing a verbal explanation or a text that the learners have to read, or maybe a video or film they're watching. But then on the other side is output. This is the speaking and the writing that learners need to do. And the input and the output needs to be supported. What you're seeing on the screen here are some ways to guide or support lesson input. We can do this through the use of visual aids like pictures or diagrams or other visual representations alongside your verbal explanation or alongside a text. And indeed, pictures or diagrams can also be used as a basis for tasks. We don't really have time to explore that, but that's also another way in which pictures and images can be used in lessons as part of tasks. We can use glossaries and word banks alongside texts, for example, to guide understanding. We can provide learners with opportunities to access the L1, their first language, as a way to guide their understanding. We can also provide extra resources to help their understanding, maybe within a lesson or outside of the lesson. We can use graphic organizers, like a mind map, for example, as a way to help learners to understand inputs. And linking back to the previous tip, we can provide opportunities for learners to work together, like the example I gave previously of a jigsaw reading task. So that opportunity to work together is also support and a way of guiding understanding. The 4th tip then is about supporting learners to produce language, whether that's spoken or written. And again, I've got some suggestions on the screen for how to do that. We might, for example, use things like sentence starters or gap fills, where you take words out of sentences, but this would be a way to help learners at a sentence level. We might also use graphic organizers, mind maps, as a way to help learners with their writing or with their speaking. We can use model or example text, so learners can see the type of spoken or written text that they're aiming to produce themselves. We can use speaking and writing frames. So these are frames which contain examples of language that learners can use in their speaking or in their writing. And again, we can use, linking back again to the 2nd tip, we can use cooperative learning structures, learners working in groups that help to encourage, in this case, their speaking. So I've got some examples there of cooperative learning structures. A communication regulator discussion is a discussion that you set up that has rules to it. So, for example, learners are in groups and each learner has has 3 contribution cards. And in order to talk in the discussion, they have to put a card down. Once they've used up all their cards, they can't talk anymore. They have to listen. So it's a way of equalizing the communication. A pyramid discussion I mentioned earlier, that's a think, pair, share discussion format. Again, it encourages learners to speak to each other. Right, so tips 3 and 4 or about supporting learners from the point of view of input and from the point of view of output. The fifth and final tip then is about identifying the language of your subject. Now, the first thing you're likely to think about when you think about the language of your subject is specialist vocabulary that's related to your subject. But what I'm showing here on the screen with the example of maths is that there's lots of kinds of vocabulary, or if you like, categories of vocabulary to be aware of. So as well as the specialist vocabulary, there are also everyday words that are used in maths, but used in a specialized way. You can see some examples there on the screen. There's also everyday words used in maths that are also used in other subjects, but in different ways. There's combinations of words that are used in a specialist way, like square root. There are compound nouns as well, highest common factor. And then there's words that are related to the kinds of talking about maths that you want learners to be doing, like talking about a procedure or comparing things in some way. So all this is examples of language. If we go back to the very first tip, where you might need to put the volume control for language up at a particular moment in a lesson, this is language that you might need to make salient, to highlight, to focus learners, to give them an opportunity to work on this language so they understand it. And it's not only the specialist vocabulary. And with that in mind, the language of your subject is related as well to the kinds of thinking that learners need to do in your subject. Like, for example, in science, learners need to think about procedure. They need to use the language of procedure. They need to give scientific description. So they need the language of description. They need to give scientific explanation as well. So they need the language of explanation. You can see lots of examples on the screen there. I'm not suggesting that this covers everything. It certainly doesn't. There are many other aspects to the language of science that we could explore. But again, the point is that there's much more to the language of the subject than just the specialist vocabulary. And just as a point of comparison, let's look at some aspects of the language of history. So as historians, you use language to recount, right? To recount events from the past. So the language of recounting. But also, historians provide historical explanation. That's different, though, to the language of explanation that's associated with science. I mean, one clear difference is that the language of explanation in history, at least when you do it through English, focuses on using past tenses, whereas in science, the focus when you're explaining things tends to be in using the present tense. But again, this is not by any means everything about the language of history. There's a lot more that we could explore. And as well as language at this word and sentence level, we could also think about the language of subjects at text level in terms of the sorts of texts that are associated with a subject. Right. I've been talking for quite a long time now. Just to sum up the tips that I've now explained. Number one was plan sequences of learning using the 3 dimensions of CLIL. 2, base the teaching and learning on tasks. 3, guide learners' understanding of lesson inputs. 4, support learners to produce spoken and written outputs. And 5 is identify the language of your subject. So I didn't get interrupted, but perhaps there are some questions.
There are indeed a couple of questions for you, Jason, and
Okay.
Ellen's been doing a valiant job in the chat in the Q&A of answering lots of technical questions as well. So I guess a very important question for you is, do you expect pupils to talk in English between them, amongst themselves during the tasks?
Well, the answer to that is it depends on whether the learners are ready to do that. You know, what I'm certainly not wanting to suggest with any of my tips, or indeed, you know, more broadly when we think about CLIL, there's not a set of rules that you have to follow, right? So the answer to that question is, well, you know, it depends if the learners are ready. Maybe if you want them to do that talking in a group, they need support to do that. So perhaps they need a speaking frame, some language on the table, and you know, for them to access where they're doing the speaking, so that they can look at it, and that helps them with the speaking. But there's also no reason why you can't use a translanguaging approach, which would
Can you
involve,
elaborate on that a
well,
little?
translanguaging is the idea that you create spaces for several languages in your lesson, right? So you could, and again, I'm not saying, please don't take this as being a sort of rule that I'm suggesting, but certainly when learners are starting off with DNL, for example, it might make sense to use a translanguaging approach where you say, right, I want you to talk in your groups in French, sharing your ideas, but be ready to report back to me as the teacher and the whole of the class in English. Or I'll give you another example. Maybe you provide the learners with a text that they read in English, but you then give them the opportunity to provide answers to questions, also perhaps set in English, but their answers can be in French. So that would be another example of translanguaging. So the answer really is to think about the needs of the learners.
Very good, thank you. And there was a very interesting question that you answered actually in the chat, Ellen, but I thought maybe it would be interesting to say it out loud. Somebody asked about being intimidated by the certification. I thought your answer was particularly encouraging.
Yeah, the simple answer is that there are no risks, so you shouldn't be intimidated. And to say the truth, we are members of the jury, and most of the time we are just impressed by the fact that you try to make your teaching richer and better. So you should just go for the oral exam, and we're always very happy to welcome you and to listen to you, because most of the time you have very nice projects. So just go for it. Don't be intimidated. We are, when we listen to you and how good you are. I was an English teacher for a long time. I'm not sure I would have been able to teach math at the same time. So if you're a math teacher or a science teacher and you contemplate teaching math or sciences in English, well, you have my respect. So I am intimidated. You shouldn't be.
Brilliant, thank you. And Jason, it seems what was really nice during the webinar was seeing the community that was forming in the chat of people talking to each other, sharing their details, sharing their profiles. There seemed to be a lot of PE teachers, of physical education teachers. And I was wondering, do you think what you've described can work just as well in a PE class?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how it's going to look will vary from subject to subject. I mean, CLIL in maths is not the same as CLIL in physical education, and CLIL in history is different again. But the principles of thinking about tasks, thinking about those 3 dimensions of CLIL and how they're adjusted, particularly in terms of preparing learners with language that they're then going to need for a task. thinking about the support that learners are needed in terms of understanding lesson input, supporting the outputs, and then the language of your subject, because for sure there's the language of physical education. All those tips, I think, are relevant absolutely to a physical education teacher.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for all the interesting questions. Ellen, did you want to say a few words about ELTV?
I was just answering another question, but okay. Yeah, there were several questions about ETLV, l'enseignement en co-animation. And I would say it's very interesting to try to pass the DNL certification if you are an ETLV teacher. And as a matter of fact, in the Eco Clubs project, I have several teachers that decided that they would try to get this certification. Some were from STI2D, so they were science teachers. I also have SVT teachers, teachers in physics, mathematics, even sports, because at the end of the day, what is relevant is how you will get integrated to this project that the DNL is all about. So of course, if you teach ETLV, it makes sense to try to get the certification. It will probably make your work easier and your collaboration with the English teacher easier as well, because you will literally speak the same language. So yeah, you can do that, of course. And I'm going to answer Madame Morfois. I'm writing the answer right now.
Lovely, thank you. And I think that's kind of the spirit of DNL. It's an innovative approach, and it gives you an opportunity to create connections, as you have tonight in the chat, but within the school, between language teachers, subject teachers, and with the students in a different way. So it's certainly an exciting an exciting pedagogical approach to experiment with.
Can I just
Now,
add to that, George?
sure, please do.
I think as well, you know, the teaching in DNL will also impact the teaching that you do through French. Certainly that's been my experience of, you know, training teachers all around the world, but also in France. A lot of all those tips that I talked about can also be applied to an L1 teaching situation as well. So it's an opportunity to think again about teaching and to explore teaching, and that will benefit teaching, all the teaching that you do.
Nicely said. Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you, Hélène. We're very, very pleased to have had you with us, and I hope you've all found it interesting. Now, Solène, my colleague, is putting some links in the chat. First of all, you have the link to the recent report that we've just published on CLIL in primary education in France. Then you have a link to the post-webinar task. We strongly encourage you to do the post-webinar task. You've got the link there, and we'll be emailing it to you tomorrow, along with the slides, the recording, and the post-webinar task. So have a look at it, use it to help you as you build your project and move forward. Thank you, Jason, for all your hard work on that task. I'm also putting in the chat the link to the feedback form. Now, the feedback form is very important for us, but it's also very important for you, because at the end of the feedback form, you have the link to download your attendance certificate. When you get to the certificate, please make sure that you fill out your name, you click on print to PDF, and then you'll have it to keep and to share with any of your inspectors or others. Thank you very much for all your time today. Thank you both to Jason and Hélène for all the many answers and the enlightening tips. And it's been a real pleasure having you all here with us tonight. We'll be in touch, we'll be emailing you. So thank you very much, and bonne chance as you embark on this adventure. Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.